In this section, we'll talk about the essentials that an executive should understand about Chile's wine regions. When we say executive essentials, we're referring to four things, generally speaking. One should know about the grapes from a given region. Yeah, that's important. You should know about the flavors and aromas in a given wine, from a given region. How to pair that with food is also very important. So pairing a bottle with food or food with a bottle from that region. And fourthly, there are often certain bottles that are specific, that you should really be able to recognize on the menu. Certain specific makers that may have collectible status or cult status or are simply important to know. Now, taking this discussion into Chile specifically. Chile, what I would remember about Chile is that Chile does a lot of quality Cabernet and Merlot, or things that people would refer to as international varietals, and they do so with a lot of Bordeaux grapes. But when I say here Bordeaux roots, both Cabernet and Merlot are originally grapes from the Bordeaux region. So there are 5 grapes that are used in Bordeaux, and Cabernet and Merlot are the 2 most important grapes in that blend, or the 2 most renowned grapes in that Bordeaux blend. And they've made their way now down to Chile, and they do quite well. Chile puts out a lot of many approachable Cabernets and Merlots, but also some of higher quality or higher tannin. But the Bordeaux roots is interesting. I think where it's most interesting is that Chile now is building an identity around a grape called Carmenere. Carmenere is less known than these international varietals, or the Cabernet and Merlot, these big Bordeaux grapes. The interesting fact of the matter is, Carmenere actually also has a history leading back into Bordeaux, which we'll cover. But geographically, Chile is like a little sliver. There isn't much land between the ocean and the Andes Mountains. It makes for a very dramatic scenery. These wineries are beautiful. You can see the Andes in the background. That's also true of Argentina, which their vineyards are just on the other side of this range. But geographically, very interesting and very, very beautiful, as a matter of fact. So, the grapes overall, we talked about Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Carmenere. Cabernet, Cabernet often is known as the king of grapes. Cabernet is often blended with Merlot, so rather than talk about both Cabernet and Merlot, we'll just focus on Cabernet. And Cabernet Sauvignon from Chile is often known to have a bit softer style, a little bit softer tannin than, for example, a Cabernet from France or a Cabernet from California, for example. So oftentimes a little bit more approachable Chilean Cabernet. Now, what can you expect in a glass of Cabernet? You could expect black cherry, currant, black currant. Often people pick out the characteristic of green bell pepper in Cabernet Sauvignon. That's particularly prevalent when the grapes haven't quite ripened enough, but green bell pepper is one of the markers of Cabernet in the glass. Wood scents, so cedar, possibly oak, the fresh smell of tobacco. Cabernets and Bordeaux grapes in general, or Cabernets as well, they tend to spend some time aging on oak, and that imparts that wood scent, but that also imparts vanilla scent as well sometimes. In terms of pairing Cabernet with food, with Cabernet, think beef. So think steak. You want to think meats really. Cabernet is one of the quintessential steak wines or beef wines. It can also work well with aged cheeses, deep dark sauces, certain herbs and spices that would go well with this. Things you would expect in a roast, for example. So rosemary or sage, sort of very pronounced herbs like this. So what's the winemaker to know for Cabernet Sauvignon? Well, Concha y Toro is one of the biggest producers. That's probably the one I would know. Very easy to find. You'll see this on menus. Recognizable. And they also put out quality wine. Let's shift now to Carmenere, because for me the most interesting story in Chile's wine, let's say wine identity, is the story surrounding Carmenere. It's true that Cabernet comes from Bordeaux. It's also true that Merlot comes from Bordeaux. What many don't know is that Carmenere also comes from Bordeaux. Bordeaux has 5 grapes, but before any of those 5, let's say so-called Bordeaux varietals, Bordeaux reds, were even widely grown in Bordeaux, you had Carmenere before all of that. Carmenere is the grape that predates all of the Bordeaux grapes. Right? It owns as much of a right to claim itself as a Bordeaux grape as any of them. It's really the Bordeaux grape. Now, phylloxera affected Carmenere. Later you saw Carmenere decline in importance. People haven't made as much wine out of it in France. But now you see a lot of Carmenere doing very well and finding a home in Chile. And for any wine region, it's interesting for it to find its home in a grape that does particularly well in its own soil. So across the Andes, for example, in Argentina, you see that with Malbec. also a Bordeaux grape. In Chile, I think you'll see that increasingly so with Carmenere, and I think it's interesting if they were to do that, and something interesting for you to know. So Carmenere, what is it like? Well, Carmenere, expect blackberry, raspberry, also expect pepper. And here, it's a rich wine, so I would expect a chocolate or a coffee. I think those two would be the scents that I would probably, or the flavors I would probably pick out. Also, would spend some time on oak, so look for oak and vanilla. But Carmenere is a pretty robust wine. You could use Carmenere much like you would use other Bordeaux varietals, actually. What would you pair that with? Well, perhaps spicy meat dishes. Here, any meat would be fine. Dark chocolate, so I mentioned coffee and maybe cocoa on the nose, but it would also be a very good match with dark chocolate. Rosemary, garlic, big flavors would go well with Carmenere. It will be able to stand up to those flavors. In terms of who I would look to for a bottle of Carmenere, think of perhaps Calaterra. This is one well-known producer. If you saw this on the menu, I think you could be comfortable that you'll be getting a quality wine from this maker. So, the essentials. Well, Cabs and Merlots are coming out from Chile. Here you'll see a lot of Chilean Cab, a lot of Chilean Merlot, a little bit softer than perhaps what you would see with a French left bank Cabernet, or let's say a Cabernet from the U.S., but quality and consistent and pretty good value. Bordeaux roots. So these grapes, Merlot and Cabernet, they're Bordeaux grapes, but the most interesting story is this story about Carmenere, which is a Bordeaux grape that predates the other Bordeaux grapes we've mentioned, and it's finding its new home and identity in Chile.